Greetings, dear viewer, and welcome to Purposes Crossed, where I hope that people who are called by Jesus for different purposes cross paths and exchange ideas. We continue with our series of devotions on the Psalms, and today we are dealing with Psalm 5. The superscription tells us that this is a Psalm of David, composed specifically for accompaniment by wind instruments. Now, I am publishing this video at the wrong time of day in India, for David clearly tells God in verse 3 that he is bringing his petition before God in the morning. But this will perhaps allow for those for whom Psalm 5 is relevant to prepare themselves for the next morning. We do not know when during David's life he composed this psalm. Was he still a young boy tending his father's flocks? Or was he running away from Saul? Was he already king? Was he running away from Absalom? We have so many details of David's life and so many periods that could serve as backdrop for this psalm. Perhaps that in itself is providential, because knowing this psalm was relevant to David in many periods of his life would enable us to realize that this psalm is relevant to many periods of our lives as well. While reading this psalm in preparation for this video, two things struck out as being critically important. First, in verse 3, David tells God, "O Lord, in the morning you hear my voice. In the morning I plead my cause to you and watch." David had full confidence that God would respond to his prayer, and so he decided that having raised his prayer to God, he would watch and wait to see how God would respond. He was not going to take things into his own hands and try to solve the problem himself. The later verses in the psalm seem to indicate that there was an issue of slander. People were spreading lies about David, and he asked God to hold them accountable. The thing about lies is that they can spread only if there is already an element of distrust. Only when the relationship is already strained can a falsehood about one party take hold. But in such a situation, just affirming your innocence will serve absolutely no purpose, because people will then just say you are being defensive. And the more strongly you plead your innocence, the more likely people will accuse you of being aggressive and will conclude that this aggression is also a proof of your guilt. Slander is, in other words, is a very difficult situation to deal with. Only the exposure of the slander as lies by a third party would have the chance of convincing the persons concerned that you were wrong. And so David asked God to work behind the scenes to uncover the lies that were being spread about him. God was aware of David's innocence in this matter and knew that his enemies were spreading lies about him. And God knew exactly how David's enemies planned to continue spreading their lies and how they planned to use those lies against David. God, therefore, was in a position to determine the best way in which to clear David's name. And so David surrendered this situation to God and asked him to act on his behalf. He would faithfully wait to see how God would act to clear his name. Second, in verse 5, David says, "Lead me, O Lord, in your righteousness because of my enemies. Make your way straight before me." David had people out to get him, his enemies. If he faltered even a bit, they would have had a field day and would have been able to garner even more support for their cause against David. This was like a great game of chess that David was playing, but he was blindfolded. Not only that, he could not predict what his enemies would do. He did not even know what the board looked like to make a move. And so he asked God for clear guidance so that he would be able to know what to do and how to do that in the right way. So many times we find ourselves in similar situations. At work, there may be colleagues who are just waiting for us to take a misstep. There may be even family members who are working some angle to rob us of our inheritance. There could be neighbors who nosily pry into our lives in order to get some juicy bit of gossip to spread. And the list goes on. When there are people like this in our lives, we need to be careful about how we act, because any act can be twisted and misconstrued to show us in a bad light. David knew this, and he asked God to give him clear guidance so that his enemies would not be able to make a case against him. So we have two things that we can take away from Psalm 5. First, when faced with a complicated situation in our lives, especially one dealing with our reputation, we should allow God to vindicate us. Trying to fix things ourselves would only make things worse. Second, when we know that there are people just waiting for us to falter, we need to ask God for guidance on how to act so that we would not give them occasion to make a case against us. This calls for wisdom. Like Reinhold Niebuhr's Serenity Prayer says, God grant me the serenity to accept the things I cannot change, courage to change the things I can, and wisdom to know the difference. And so, in a similar way, we should know when to let God act and when we should act, and we should ask God for the wisdom to know the difference, and also when we have to act, the wisdom how to act. Thank you.